Hello, good morning. Thank you for being here. It's lovely to see you all. It feels like it's nighttime here already, but it's not. My name is Robin Bresnahan, and I host a radio program called Ottawa Morning on CBC Radio, and I got to sleep in this morning, so thank you.
Oh,
yes.
our pleasure.
Yes, thank you very much. When the NAC asked me to moderate one of these Arctic Imaginations talks, I said, okay, I could do one, and I chose this one because just as you are here to listen to these amazing gentlemen in conversation, I wanted to be witness to that as well. I've had the pleasure of interviewing Ed before, and so any chance that I can get to do that again, that's wonderful. Of course, these two probably need no introduction, but I'm going to do it anyway. Edward Burtynsky is one of this country's most accomplished photographers. He's gone to all ends of the earth to explore the effects of human activity that it has had on this precious planet. Hands up, who here caught the Anthropocene exhibition? Okay, lots of you at the National Gallery. Oh, 2 hands up from Raoul. And I should say hello to our live stream audience as well, because we are broadcasting this as well on the internet, so people will be listening from all over the world. It was a stunning exhibition, and we're going to talk about your new one as well, Ed. So welcome to Ottawa. Delighted to have you here.
Great to be here, Robin.
Also, Monique Rosing. He is a world-renowned geologist from Greenland originally. He was just telling me that he grew up in a tiny little settlement of 8 people in Greenland, and his family made up 5 of those people. So that's quite extraordinary. That's right, yes, exactly. He's now a professor at the University of Copenhagen, and he is also an artist in his own right. He was involved with a project called Ice Watch, which took these giant ice blocks that were harvested from a fjord in Greenland and placed them in clock formations in notable cities, Copenhagen and Paris and London, and people would go and watch them as they melted. And so we're going to get him to talk about that. And the theme of today's discussion is the implications of a warming Arctic. So before we get to it, can we just take a moment of gratitude to acknowledge where we are today? Because the NAC sits on the unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe. They are the past, the present, the future stewards of this land, and we thank them very much. So welcome to you all. We're going to have a discussion first for about 45 minutes, and then afterwards you will have the opportunity, both you here at the NAC and sitting at home, wherever you are in the world, to ask questions to both Ed and Monique. So yeah, let's get going. Monique, let's start with you, because I'd love to hear about the exhibition that you did, Ice Watch, and the reaction that you had from people when you put these giant blocks of ice in places like London and Paris and Copenhagen. What was the point of it?
Well, the point of it was actually manifold. I think one of them was, as here now we're talking about the fascination with the Arctic, so that is, the iceberg is kind of an emblemic thing for the Arctic region. Ice and coldness is what defines the Arctic. So that was part of it, but of course it was also to raise awareness of climate change. And when we did it the first time, that was before the COP15 meeting in Copenhagen, where it was planned that the Paris Agreement should have been the Copenhagen Agreement, and the IPCC, the scientific panel on climate change were meeting in Copenhagen, and that was at a time when it was actually still controversial. I guess you can still find corners here and there where it is controversial that climate change is real and it is caused by human activity. But at that time it was actually something that was still controversial. And we thought that we would bring attention to the fact that the scientific council for this was in Copenhagen, but also, again, make people realize that this is real. And the idea, it was Olafur Eliasson, Danish-Icelandic artist, and myself who did it. And I think one of the ideas that is behind that is that, as a scientist, you can help people get somewhere or do something if they want to go there. But scientists can never make people want to do anything. Scientists can make people, sit and fall asleep or whatever. But it's not kind of the thing that make people want to do stuff. But art is something that moves people, and they would want to do something. So instead of lecturing everybody, this is so and so difficult and this is dangerous, and now listen, and so many tons CO2 and whatever, we just bring these icebergs that are beautiful in their own right, and let them melt, and let the message seep in from that. So we did that for Copenhagen at the pre-COP15 meeting. Then we did it again in Paris for the COP21, and it seemed to work the second time because we got the Paris Agreement, only due to our installation, of course. But I think one of the things that is important in this is that it's not to tell about the horrors of what might happen. It is to tell about the beauty that we stand to lose. I think that is a much better aspiration for doing something, that we have something beautiful that we can't afford to lose, than the fear of the consequences of something that might or might not happen. So that was it. And it was, when we installed it in Paris, it was very, very funny because Paris is a very bureaucratic city. Bureaucracy is a French word, as you know, and it was very difficult to get everything. But we managed actually to be allowed to put these and have it be a secret until they were there. So we put them in the middle of the night. Big trucks came in and we placed these. There were 100 tons of ice that we put on the Place de la Panthéon in Paris. And we saw a lone bicyclist after we were finished come up the hill on his bicycle, and he's just, what is this? And he stopped kind of in his motion and put his feet down, and the bicycle fell between his feet, and he went over and then he took his hand out. Yes, they are cold. This is real ice. And I think that was one of the messages, is that ice, actually, we can read about. We know that ice is cold, but we never knew that actually, until we touch it, what that means that it's cold. Then if you stand next to the iceberg, it turns out to be a living creature. It has a breath, you know, it's exhaling air as it was before we started polluting it 10,000 years ago, because it's caught in little ice bubbles. It makes noises, cracks, water trickles. Little kid can come and drink the water trickling off the iceberg. So I think the mission was accomplished when we saw that people were actually more intrigued by the beauty than by the horror. And if we get time later, because I think you would want to say one or two things as well.
I'm enjoying this.
Yeah, I know. But actually, it's quite interesting because it also sparked some questions. Like when we were there, people would come and ask questions and do various things, and that was an opportunity to explain what the background between all this was as well. But we can take that at a later point.
Well, I would love to hear your perspective on that, because that point about appreciating the beauty and using that as a way to spark change rather than scaring people, because some of your photos, albeit beautiful, are terrifying.
And it's interesting you say terrifying, because if I look at what I've done over the 40 years, and that's really when I started in 1981, I kind of shifted from photographing the landscape to photographing the man-altered landscape. And I fell in love with that pristine landscape first. As a child, just being in forests and all of that really embedded itself as a way to kind of reference what nature intended on the planet. And it's out of that reference point that I thought, well, if I spent a whole career just photographing that, in a way it felt out of sync with my time. And so what I started to think about is that man-altered landscape. If I went and searched out the largest examples, and I was kind of, as a youth, I saw my father working in a car plant and the making of engines. I worked in a frame plant building, truck frames. I went and worked in a mine in Red Lake in northern Ontario. I saw big open pit mines when I was 19, saw the big trucks with the big tires, and I went, people don't know this world. And I think out of the beginning of the work is to just kind of reconnect us to those other worlds, like those other ages, the Stone Age, the Iron Age, the Copper Age. They're all alive and well at a scale that is, breathtaking. And it was really, I think, out of a sense of awe at the beginning that I was actually going there to photograph it and to kind of show people, like, this is a crazy world that we're creating to make the world we live in. So, in a way, the kind of disaster landscape or terrifying landscape is. It's kind of interesting because these are all intentional landscapes. These are all business as usual. These are companies that have gotten permits to do it, licenses to do it. They're hiring people. They're paying their taxes. It's creating an economy So this isn't something that, you know, is happening outside of our, what normal is, but it is an extension of our habitat. You know, we can't have this place without creating those disruptions in nature. So that really has been the thesis of my work. And so when somebody says this is a disaster landscape, I'm saying, well, if that's a disaster landscape, so is everything in your life, right? Your house, your car, getting on a plane, all of that is, you know, these are equivalents. This is the yin to the yang that I'm photographing, but we never get out to the yin. So, you know, so that to me has been this kind of being the medium through and using photography as a conduit to our urban consciousness, that there is another world that is equally part of our world, but we don't see it. And then I chose to photograph it in a way that references a lot of art historical moments, abstract expressionism, you know, even 19th century photography. Sometimes I'd reference that, this kind of pure response to a landscape that's kind of clean. And so I use different modalities of looking to try and translate that in a way that makes the viewer a little destabilized, because it's like, wow, this is pretty surreal looking. Where is this? Or look at the scale of that. And to destabilize somebody with a photograph today is very hard to do. We are so image conscious, and we're all working with images. I think I read at some point that, you know, we look at 10,000 images a day. If you look at all the billboards and phones and, you know, magazines and everywhere where images pop up, we're surrounded by them. So in that world of saturation, I'm also looking at a moment where you stand in front of an image and you go, where is this? And how could this image be of our world? And so these kind of alien kind of feeling landscapes are really, you know, our world, but they do feel like they're of another world.
Let's talk about the Arctic, because we're in the green room, and these two have never met in person before, but they became fast friends in about 2.5 seconds because they started comparing pictures of fish that they have caught. And Ed showed this...
In the Arctic.
In the Arctic, because Ed has done a bucket list trip to Nunavut and went fishing, and there's this beautiful picture of him in this Arctic char, and Monique said, well, that's not fair. So there was a lot of disbelief. And but when it comes to the Arctic and the theme of this conversation, the implications of a warming Arctic, what keeps you up, which you've said at night, is the state of the oceans. Talk to us about that.
Well, I actually do say that when people say, what am I most worried about? I'm thinking, well, you know, there may be ways in which we can course correct when it comes to CO2. We may find ways to sequester some of it, and through technologies we may find some kind of geotechnical ways in which, you know, I've heard of satellite kites up between the, you know, the sun and the earth, and to pretty much put up an umbrella and shade us if it's really getting to a point where we're losing control. There's some things that are within the plausible. Sulfites also is another one for cooling the planet, which was learned through, you know, when big volcanoes hit, the global temperature drops by a couple of degrees because of all the sulfites in the stratosphere. So I don't think it's a good idea, that one, but kites may be more benign. But there are things that there could be a conversation about that we might be able to kind of course correct if we can't slow down the CO2 emissions quick enough to stop the worst from happening. But when I think about the oceans, I can't think of anything in our toolkit. If they start warming and they start getting acidified, I don't think there's anything in our toolkit that can reverse that, because that's going to just take tens of thousands of years to cool back down to its, you know, normal status. So it is the oceans that I think, you know, so I remember listening to a TED talk, and the speaker I can't remember their name, they got up and they said, we named Earth wrong. We should have called it ocean. It's 2/3 surface water and 1/3 land. And so we are a planet that's determined, and our climate, the rains that come on us, all of that are all driven by the ocean currents and by the waves and by the air that's formations of the oceans. And so when something happens to them, we go for that ride. I don't think there's anything we can do.
Monique, you said during a conversation we had the other day that you thought that the Arctic might not exist by the end of the century.
Well, I think that the Arctic is many things and can be defined in different ways, but the classical kind of geographical explanation or definition of the Arctic is where the summer temperature is below 10 degrees C. And that's basically north of the tree line, where you go from the forest to the tundra. That is the definition of the Arctic. And by that traditional definition, at the rate things are going, because you probably have heard of what's called the Arctic amplification. That means that the general temperature increase for the planet on average is multiplied by about 4 to 6 in the Arctic. So that means that a 1.5 degree temperature increase for the average of Earth would be 6 to 8 to 10 degrees. And that clearly will basically wipe Arctic off the planet by its current definition. So we are looking into a future where the Arctic doesn't exist by the end of this century. Luckily, people who go to stuff like this are in general so old that it doesn't matter too much. But if you look into the next generation, it does matter. And I think that's the sad news. And I think that there's something interesting in the way that oftentimes we talk about the Arctic in relation to climate is in the context of the canary in the mine. It's kind of, we look to the Arctic and say, whoa, there's something terrible going on. We better start acting differently. As though the Arctic didn't exist in its own right. And the Arctic is also home to people, to populations, to cultures. And there's, as some people would say, it's a human right to be cold. I mean, for some people, it's a necessity to be cold. And in that sense, I think we should stop looking at the Arctic as a symptom, but also looking at the loss of the Arctic as a problem in its own right. But I think we should maybe even more importantly not look at the Arctic as a problem at all, but we should look at it as an opportunity. I think it's much more fun to be people in the Arctic if the Arctic is part of the solution to our problems, and the Arctic can be part of the solutions. And as Ed was just talking about the oceans, it's true that the oceans are, in many ways, you can say the oceans are where we see long-lasting changes that will be difficult to reverse. But on the other hand, the ocean are also what saved us until now from much worse consequences, because it's a big reservoir of cold, but also is a reservoir of carbon dioxide. It has a capacity to take up carbon dioxide. So anyway, the Arctic could actually be a place where we have an opportunity to try to counter some of these problems in the Arctic, particularly acidification. So I think that we should try not looking at the Arctic either as a symptom or as a victim, but as an agent. I think Arctic needs agency.
Can I ask you how? I mean, when you say that it can be part of our solutions, how?
Well, of course, global problems can only be solved by simple means. I think if something is very sophisticated, you cannot roll it out on a global scale. No, but I think that we understand the Earth system well enough. We actually understood how the climate is coupled to biology and to geology and everything else. We have understood that for 100 years or so. And one of the things we know is that it is controlled by nutrient fluxes. And the reason why almost all the reason why people from the other parts of the world have been going to the Arctic whaling and fishing and whatever for 1,000 years is because the ocean around the Arctic has enormous productivity. And the reason why it has enormous productivity is because mineral nutrients are being leaked into the ocean from the land, mainly around Greenland where you have an ice cap. And that's because the ice cap is a big grinding machine that crushes the minerals into something that is basically soluble in water and sets it out with the meltwater. So the rivers where we catch our Arctic chars, not those big ugly ones that you go for, but normal size Arctic chars. He only goes for the obscene ones, but we like nice normal Arctic chars. But they live in these meltwater rivers that look like milk, basically, and this material is what actually counters the acidification of the ocean and also can increase the capacity of the ocean to take up carbon dioxide. But as it is now, it stays in the Arctic. It goes out and dumps out in the fjord and makes walking and sailing and everything else difficult. But if you take it from the Arctic to the tropics or to other parts of the more temperate part of the world, it'll be activated and it will go into these natural cycles. So I think it's really important that we understand that the scale of things are something that is scalable, and that is something that is scalable. The Greenland ice cap makes 1 billion tons of this material every year. That's more than anyone can move in any place. So I think you have to think of the world, of the Earth, basically, a little bit like any other engine. That if you have electrical engine, you need 2 poles to make it run, and the more difference is between the 2 poles, the better it runs. So if you connect the Arctic to the tropics, you have a large potential gradient, and you can make a lot of work done. If you take 2 things in the Arctic, you have very little potential gradient, and the machine goes very slowly. So anyway, I think that this is just one example, but we can find many examples where the Arctic can help mitigate the problems that we have made for ourselves, and we have to start thinking about that.
Would you like a chance to rebuttal about the Arctic char?
We did catch some smaller ones too.
Oh,
yeah.
Thank you.
And yeah, no, it's just interesting what you're saying, and but the thing in fact of what I've been photographing, and whether it's oil fields or looking at the energy footprint of China and looking and going into developing worlds like India, where these coal stations are still being built, and even if looking at the most recent problems with, gas and oil coming from Russia and the embargoes and all that. Now everybody's spiking up their, their research and all that. So, and even with the melting in the Arctic, as it's melting, it's making more gas fields open to. So all of that is that, in that having Arctic have its agency, but in the kind of reality that I've seen is that, the human kind of experiment of 8 billion of us moving to 10, and the kind of base energy footprint that it takes. But what worries me is that, even with the full knowledge of what's happening, is there anything in the human toolkit that can bring us together politically and through engineering and scientifically to decide on how are we going to make this transition? I think transition is the key word at this point, away from the damaging CO2 emissions to a more sustainable world, and can we get there fast enough? And so I think those are the things that also keep me up, is that having seen and stared China and India and these large populations, and more recently Africa, and looking at what's happening there and their desire to achieve the kind of lifestyle and opportunity that we have, is the problem that I see is a very, very bitchy one to fix.
No, I totally agree, and I think also you said earlier you said that all these scars we see in the landscape are some way a reflection of ourselves, and I think that's one of the big problems when we talk about climate change, is as we have acquired some guilt for having caused this for no particular reason, but it was not for no particular reason, it was for a very good reason. Our life has been, everything in our life that we value comes from the access to cheap fossil energy, basically. Or it would have come from renewable energy had we known how to do it, but not at the time. So I think so there's also kind of this culture war going on, where should we place the blame for this, and who did what, and in the Arctic we oftentimes also talk about it as though it's something that somebody did to us, but per capita people in the Arctic are some of the highest emitters in the world. Only there are so few of us that it doesn't really add up to anything. But the reason I think the main part of it, and that comes back to what you just said, are sociological. It's because the benefits of what we get from the cheap energy are so immense. Today, every human person, not in our part of the world, but in the whole world, every human person have 20 human power to dispose of. So we have from the energy we get. So everybody of us we only do 1/20 of our needs ourselves. So we can lie on the couch and the dishwasher is doing the dishes, and it's wonderful. And I think before we can get a change, we have to embrace the fact it's actually wonderful to have this energy. That's why the renewable energy now being cheaper and in many ways more convenient than the traditional is the best thing that have happened. The bad thing is that scaling it up takes time, and it takes resources that are difficult to find.
Forgive the simplicity of this question, but if you say that we could lose the Arctic, by the end of the century. What is this Earth without the Arctic?
It's a very different place, and there's something that seems to tell us that we are already standing on this, maybe past the threshold into a different world that we don't know and we cannot predict. And I think one of the, you say, I live in California, what people in California say scares living daylight out of me is Vancouver 2021. So if you look at Vancouver through the past 50 years, summer temperature, winter temperatures have been going in an absolute predictable up and down every year, as long as everybody has known. And the maximum summer temperature has been within a little bell curve distribution around a mean that has very, very little variation. And then bang, 2021, it goes up to 4 sigmas out from the, which means basically it's an event that is not supposed to happen except every 10,000 years, and now it seems to have happened twice. And I think that is something that really scares me, because that tells that we don't have a climate that is predictable anymore. And that keys directly back to the loss of the Arctic, because what made the Arctic is that you have some part of what is circumpolar wind systems that kept the cold in the Arctic where it belongs and kept the clement climate at the other side of that system. And that has got completely out of whack and is going back and forth. That causes these very cold winters in northern China and eastern and central North America, but also cause these complete out-of-scale temperature excursions in the northern hemisphere. So I think that that is one of the consequences. So it's not only that if you go to the Arctic, it will look differently. What happens in the Arctic doesn't stay there; it goes everywhere. And of course, it will change the climate belts. It will change the when you have water for growing your crops and when you don't, and all these things. So the world without the Arctic is not a fun place, or it could be a fun place, we don't know, but it has all likelihood that it isn't. And I think there's when we talk about climate, we always talk about as though there's good and bad climate. There's no good and there's no bad climate, but there's climate that we are adapted to. And if the climate changes from what we are adapted to, then suddenly all our investments in adaptation are gone, and then we have to, use great effort to adapt to something else. So it's not that climate is bad or good, but it's different, and that's a problem.
Just out of curiosity, for the audience who's here, not on the live stream, but hands up, who's been to the Arctic before? Ed, does that surprise you, that number of people?
Over half the room, which is great.
Half the room.
I actually think that if, as a Canadian, we are a northern country that if you've only stayed at the 49th parallel, where 85% of Canadians are within 100 kilometers of the 49th parallel of the American border, but most of our country is north. If you start looking at it, and even when I was up in Nunavut on the coast of the Arctic Ocean, and then I looked at the map and I was like halfway up. I'm thinking, wow, when you start looking at how vast that territory is. And also the thing that I found, and I was just there about a month ago, and we were looking at places where, the sides of the river, where the mud was falling, and it was very much the same kind of chalky water, but we can see ice, we can see the permafrost. And when you pick up that permafrost, and I picked up a chunk of it, and it's almost like cow dung. It's like it's all like material, and it's all the lichen and all that from thousands of years ago, and it's all built up. And that permafrost is deep; it goes quite a ways down. And that's the other one and we are like 1/3. And if you look at Russia and Siberia, it's 2/3 of the boreal forest, but it has a greater, vaster terrain of tundra. And when you walk on tundra, it's like you're walking on these hexagons. I remember I was walking on it, and if you step off of one of the tops, and at one point I had my foot go down 4 feet, and that's just all because the freeze-thaw cycle on top of that ice is created. Like when you see mud, and dry mud, you'll see all the patterns around the drying, and that's basically what's happening. But you've got lichen on top of it, which is soft, and you're walking it. But the whole thought of all of that starting to melt is I think is referred to as positive feedback loops, and then also if you don't have the white snow to reflect, you've got these other loops that are going to accelerate the warming, and if and if, of course, there's massive amounts of methane caught up in all of that lichen, and if it's starting to melt, then you've got methane coming out, which isn't as persistent in the atmosphere, but it's 32 times worse than CO2 in the atmosphere. So again, this kind of positive feedback loop on that scale is also, I think, a daunting thing. And again, nothing, I don't think, in the human toolkit, short of some way of cooling all of the Earth, whether, through some geotechnical response, technical, way in which we may be able to solve that problem if we can't get CO2 out quick enough, then that's another, and it would be interesting to hear what your thoughts on the permafrost is.
Well, I share your concern, of course. I think the degradation of all this organic material in the permafrost is another ticking bomb. I think one of the things that in general is I think it's one of the smaller contributions to greenhouse gas emissions, even if it starts to accelerate. So that doesn't mean that we shouldn't worry about it, but I think one of the things that is in the climate system is that it's out of equilibrium. That means that the atmosphere and everything else is such that even if we stopped emitting now or got it stabilized now, it will still keep changing for the next 100, 200 years or so, because we are still living on a lot of borrowed money, so to speak, the coldness of the ocean, the capacity of the system to take up CO2 and so forth. So I think that forms just one part of that that thing. I think, on the other hand, it's important not to be so daunted that we kind of say, well, nothing will help anyway, so why do anything? And I think actually we can do something. I think it's really important in all of this is that to remember that it has taken us about 200 years, maybe 150 years, to cause all this havoc in a very, very small trace gas in the atmosphere. There's extremely little. We talk about 300 to 400 parts per million of carbon dioxide. That is the problem. That is in extremely small amount. In the atmosphere, we talk about the skies being high and whatever, but they aren't. The top of the troposphere is 12 kilometers above our head. You could take that distance on a bicycle in half an hour. The atmosphere is a small compartment, and so it doesn't mean that it's easy, but it doesn't mean that it's not impossible that we can change some of these things. And so what it gives me, if not comfort, at least some hope, is that we have been able to cause this enormous change in such a short period of time with relatively simple means. And that means that if we have the will, we can do something to reverse this or to stabilize it. So I think it's really important that we remember that the strength that caused this is also the strength that allows us to mitigate it, and remember that our future is not a destiny. I think Canadians are known for being halfway Calvinists, and we all and Danes are too, and somehow we think that we did something and now we have to suffer its consequences, and that's only fair enough. Of course, I think it's more fun to do stuff and then don't suffer the consequences. So I think that's what basically what our knowledge has given us is the opportunity to not face the consequences. So I think that we have to get out of this line of thought that this is a destiny. The future is a consequence. It is a result of decisions we make today. And if we follow our decisions, the future will be different from if we just take it as a destiny. I'm absolutely confident with that.
You're a geologist. You're a photographer. Are you both activists?
Yeah, I think, from my point of view, that I think I didn't start out that way, but the fact that I've been kind of, as I said, when I first began, it was more out of a sense of awe and trying to reconnect the urban experience with the worlds that it takes to have that urban experience. And then I think as the years progressed and as the problems started to become more apparent, because back in 1982, 83, I remember around 88 for the first time hearing that CO2 could create problems in the future with warming planet. But you think, well, that's way out there somewhere, and I have to worry about that. But I think it's kind of the work is kind of met with the zeitgeist in that all of a sudden people are saying, wow, what we've done is now brought us to the threshold of real consequence. And it's actually happening, as you said. And, I often cite the 2021 in BC of how unusual that was and how scary that was. This heat dome, and then you were hearing new terminologies like polar vortex, where the cold just comes and locks in, and you've got minus 15 or 20 in Toronto for 2 weeks or a week and a half, and and these are new terms that are all coming out as a result of very unusual. Thing. So I think that I've kind of become the reluctant activist in a way. That I think the work stands as a kind of interesting compendium and testament to the scale of human endeavor, out there in places that we don't normally get to see it. And now it's somehow I think it's meeting, with what's hafpening in our world and saying, well, how did we get here? And then you look around you, well, yeah, we all understand our cities, but then we don't fully understand what deforestation looks like and what mining looks like and what, mass industry looks like, farming, for instance. So I've gone and kind of chronicled all of that at the largest scale events. So I think in a way the work does stand now as something that adds to the conversation about, what it is that we've created. And even when we did the movie and the exhibition Anthropocene, but in the movie at the end of it, we all debated a long time what to say. But it is technology that brought us to this threshold, and it's going to be some form of technology, which you're saying, that's going to actually move us out of this. So, but we have to really incentivize that transition. And I think, like, for instance, if you talk to most, economists, scientists, any climate scientists, they're all saying a carbon tax is the fastest way. And we've done that in this country with a lot of, political capital that was spent to do that. But I'm glad that we're on that path. And now, as you increase that carbon tax, you are kind of shifting and making the alternative energies more viable than the existing energy.
Before I get your answer, Monique, I feel like this is actually a good segue to look at your 60,000-foot view that most people don't have. And your new project is called In the Wake of Progress.
Yes.
And you've just started presenting that in Australia. Can we
presented in Toronto first, and at the Dundas Square, and then as an indoor experience at the Canadian Opera Company Theatre on Front Street. So, and then it just showed recently in Sydney, Australia.
Can we show a little bit of it?
Yeah, sure, just a little.
I'd like to go back to bed now. Talk to us about that.
Well, by the way, Phil Strong, who composed the music, has just won a Canadian Screen Music Award, so for the score. But so it came about as a kind of a proposition that I got in 2018 from Luminato Festival to take over all the screens in Dundas Square, which arguably is the center of commerce. Dundas and Yonge and Eaton Centre and all that, and all the digital boards are there, and it was a complete takeover of all 22 digital boards. So I started thinking, what would I do? And I thought it would be really interesting to take that as a moment to reflect on the 40 years of work that I did and put it in a sequence such that if you're a shopper leaving Eaton Center and you're caught up in this public art piece and with all 22 digital boards with music, and you're taking on this roller coaster ride of all, as I said earlier, all the worlds that it takes to create the thing in your shopping bag and the city that you're standing in. And so it was this way to kind of have a deep reflection, of what we are, what consumer capitalism is, what living in a big city is, and trying to kind of have that as a feedback loop in the center of commerce. As that was, so that's the original idea of the art piece. But then with COVID, I was supposed to have that ready, and it would have been canned music. It wouldn't have been composed. It wouldn't. But the 2 extra years allowed me to bring it into an indoor experience, really refine it, and then I worked with Bob Ezrin, who produced the music, of legend, did things like The Wall, Pink Floyd, The Wall, and other. But he's great producer, and Phil Strong. So we had a great team assembled. Iskway of First Nations, she did the vocals that were haunting throughout the piece. No words, just her vocals throughout it that really spoke. And I think the piece, what I'm trying to do with the piece is, usually when we have an empathetic moment in a film or whatever, it's usually for another character that we connect with, and some injustice is happening to them, or some other mammal is something, but it's usually a human to human or human to animal connection where we have a welling and empathetic feeling. In this case, there is no. What I want the viewer to experience is that it's the thing called nature, the forest, the biodiversity, all those things are what is being lost. To feel that there is a loss that's happening here, and to understand that biodiversity loss is a loss of richness to the world. And so it is very much a kind of a call to action, to really feel that something is happening on the world that's unprecedented, and we are in the driver's seat. We are the managers of the planet at this point. And it's a question, as you said, Minik, what are the decisions that we make now are going to be affecting the Arctic in 100 years? So it is, we are sitting in a moment where the choices that we make here and now have deep resonances with the future.
Minik, how do you reflect on what you just saw there?
Well, I think it's fascinating to see, because of course, I mean, I think what is most fascinating to me in all these works that you have done is the scale. I mean, both the beauty in the beast, you could say oftentimes that there's some beauty in the terrible things, but the other is the scale of. I think that's, for most people, it's very difficult to comprehend what is the scale of this problem and what is the scale of our activities, and I think that comes back when I talked about the and back to your question about activism with the Ice Watch thing. There was something that's always interesting, because it sparked a discussion or a dialogue with some activists who came to protest that we've done that in Paris, and they said that this was irresponsible. We had taken 100 tons of ice, and now it was melting much faster in Paris than it would have done in Greenland. So we contributed, significantly to the problem. And that gave an opportunity to exactly talk about scales. Now I'll ask you a question. How long does it take the Greenland ice cap to irreversibly, that never comes back again, lose 100 tons of ice?
Anyone have a guess? Ed?
A couple seconds.
Anyone else? 5 seconds? See, none of you have any sense of scale. The Greenland ice cap loses 100 tons of ice in 100th of a second. So this is the scale at which these things are happening. But again, on the other hand, it also, if you look into get back to the solution to the problem, which are of course also at scale, but we sometimes think that these are insurmountable problems. We talk about now we need lithium for electrification, or we need rare earth elements for this and that and the other. And everybody say, oh, this is terrible and we can't get them. And so, but which element, which mineral commodity is the most investments are placed into finding? Gold. 1/2 of all investments in mineral resources goes into looking for gold, which has hardly any practical use in this context at all. And then we talk and whine about how I don't think we can get all these things we need for the green transition, and it's difficult, and it's absolutely nonsense. Of course, it's because nobody looks for it, because it's so cheap that that we don't bother to. But it's not that we can't get it. We can just, if we decide that we go out and do it tomorrow, we can get everything we need for that in half an hour. It's just so it's also because I think that we also, and it's back to the activism, I think it's much more, to me, appealing to be analytical and point out some of these things that actually shows the ways that things can be done, rather than kind of, what you say, illustrate how impossible the whole thing looks.
Just a question: when you said if we have the will to reverse things and change things and make changes, who is we? Is it us as a humankind? Is it politicians? Who are you referring to?
I think all we starts with oneself, of course, but clearly that is what we also, I think that's why I don't think that the climate and its solutions are technological or scientific or whatever they are. They're sociological and cultural, and that's why I think that art, for instance, like you do, is really fundamentally important, because it does change people's perspective on things, and it does change the will to do something. And I think that clearly, I mean, I think we have all seen the failure of politics at all scales repeatedly. But on the other hand, you can say that we also see the strength of it, because by and large, most things do work. I got here from Copenhagen yesterday, and I am hopeful I will get back again. And and if something doesn't work, so by and large, it actually does work. The societies are actually quite well functioning for the most part. There are some things and what you see with climate is that it takes a generation basically for a new concept to be active. So I've been talking about this to school class or whatever for 30 years or something, and start getting frustrated because why does nothing ever happen? And then suddenly that generation you taught in school now are out requesting political change. So I think it's also because we don't have too much time, but on the other hand, we have to accept that these large-scale changes take time, and a generation have difficulty adjusting. A generation would rather let the next generation do the change.
We're about to take questions, but I just, out of curiosity, after exhibiting your work and for decades of doing this, what is one of the most profound reactions or things that somebody has said after seeing your work?
Well, oftentimes if I do a talk, I often have people come up afterwards and say, I saw your movie or I saw your show or something, and I shifted my, practice, and I went into environmental sciences, and can I send you my dissertation? So, in many ways, I think those are the real moments of recognizing that, what you're doing is. Because, as you said earlier, if you get an IPCC report and you're looking at graphs and charts, there's no kind of, there's no visceral reaction to it. There's no emotional connection to it. It's an intellectual kind of processing, and it can bring concern, but it doesn't have that gut feeling. It doesn't move you. And I think that's where, both science and art have a role. And I always say, like, in universities, if I get a chance to talk at university, I say, look, the humanities is often seen as the drafty, dusty building, and the engineering and science have the new shiny buildings with all, and I said, but if we don't tell our stories, if we can't get the narrative, and if we I often looked at like wind turbines. So, when I saw wind turbines, right from the very beginning, I see them as hope for the future. To me, they represent hope. But somewhere, whether it's the coal industry, the hydro plants, or whether it was the fossil fuel industry, but all of a sudden there was a lot of money being put in to grab the narrative and say, these things kill birds, they cause cancer, and worst of all, they make your real estate prices go down if you have one in your neighborhood. And all of a sudden they became these, unwanted things. So, and I actually spoke at Queen's, and they were dealing with that because there was a big, reaction to wind turbines on Wolf Island. And in that discussion with the university, I was saying, look, somebody stole the narrative. And if the narrative would have, and that's why you need the humanities department. You need people going out there and fighting for the true story, because that isn't, yes, some birds make a hit, but more birds are killed in glass towers in cities than there ever would be in a wind turbine. They don't cause cancer, and they're not that noisy, and they're usually in farmer fields, and they usually augment that farmer's income so that he doesn't have to leave the farm. And if the crops fail that year, at least I've got some money from those turbines. I think that there's, again, there's a real importance that the stories that get told are the ones that we need to tell to get people to understand that these are the kinds of changes we need to make if we want a world for our children and their children.
That was the perfect way to wrap it up nicely with a bow, saying science and art both have a role to play when we talk about the environment, for sure. Live stream audience, we love you. We haven't forgotten about you. Hello. We're taking questions from you too. But real live audience, yay, we already have one. I would say, don't be shy, as you can see. I mean, I think Monique might, he's known to throw some jabs out at you, so hopefully he won't. Teasing Ed about his Arctic char size. But try to keep your questions just really concise, so that we have time to get to as many of you as possible. So first question.
Yeah, this is a question for Edward. So when I look at your work, aside from seeing, extraordinary dystopian beauty, I also sometimes think it's kind of a form of investigative journalism. The thing that I know about investigative journalists is that they often get a lot of people in power cranky at them. And I've often, when I've looked at your work, wondered what's the reaction from, some of the companies or some of the country politicians when you photograph these kind of incredible landscapes that are also kind of appalling. And has that what are some notable reactions, and has this affected your access to doing further work?
It's interesting what you're saying about access, and it's not just, it's very rarely the work itself, but just access. Like, for instance, getting back into China, or if you look at the Anthropocene project, we went to Norilsk and Berezhniki, which is central Siberia, and up into the northern Arctic in Norilsk to look at the big colored metals mines up there, one of the largest nickel deposits in the world, and obviously that's no longer accessible. I'm Ukrainian, by the way, as well, so I wouldn't go there now. But when I look at China as well, China has become really almost inhospitable. They've thrown out all the reporters, so it's in a way, it was, back when I was starting in 2000 research, and when my first shoot was 2001, and I've done maybe 15 shoots to China. I would have, my fixer in China left because it was not worth working there. He said if you wanted to do what you did already in China, you'd get 1/10 of what you went for, and it would cost you 10 times more because of the costs that have escalated to get people to go in there and take those chances to open up those doors for you. So access has, when I look behind my career, has closed a lot. And, in some places, but in terms of usually to get into these places is often, I'd say I get into about 85% of what I try for. And it's often through hubris. I'll go and I'll talk to the CEO. I'll try and get to the very top, the most influential person within the company, and send him a bit of my work and let him know that my whole career has been looking at the largest examples of human kind of intervention in the landscape. So so I'd say, so you have the largest copper mine in the world, and that's why I'm knocking on your door. I know your other competitors, the second largest, and if you don't let me in, I'll go there. And they'll probably let me in, and it works. It's interesting that and because I've always positioned the work more in a neutral territory, more like a Rorschach test. It's there, and you can read it as an environmentalist, so it can sit as a poster for environmentalists, and it can also be on the cover of the company's annual report. So it sits in this weird place where one can read it in all kinds of ways, and to me, that's an interesting place to do it, because by doing it, it's saying it's kind of keeping it as a kind of an inflection point for a conversation. And it actually, when people come to me and say, "Oh, this is an environmental disaster," I know where you're coming from. Or if somebody says, an art historian might say, "Were you looking at abstract expressionism when you were thinking about making that picture, or whatever?" And so there's all these different layers. Or a quarry person will say, "Hey, that used to be that. See those lines there? That was a technique we used to use, and now that rock surface is a more modern technique that we're using." So all of that kind of process is embedded in all of these images as well. So, and going to, like, when I did the Anthropocene project, it was interesting because the place where I thought I'd get in trouble was RWE in outside of Cologne in Germany. So when Angela Merkel decided to shut down all the nuclear power plants, it just spiked the amount of coal that was being drawn out of RWE, because as they had to replace that power, and it also increased the dependency on Russia, which they're facing right now. But it took me a year and a half to get access, and that's the big. If you saw the film, that's that big machine with the 18 buckets, and and the 2 tons of material per bucket, largest machine ever built on the planet. It's called the Bagger 291, and so I thought, and we didn't give it a really good position in the film. We were showing a church being smashed down as they were kind of making room for the mine to move in. So it was a pretty harsh, one of the harshest things we've done with access into a company. And then the positive side of our story was the lithium mines in the Atacama Desert. We got no problem from RWE. They were fine with it. And the lithium mine, which are a positive story, got really angry with us because one article, and somebody grabbed the picture and put a headline saying, the destroyed landscape or something. And we had no, it was a review of the show and all that. We had no power over it. And they said, "Look, you're making us, look bad here." And we said, "Look, we had no, power over that. The headline, whoever did the headline made that headline. We didn't do it." So, but that was our positive story. That we need to go to these lithium and all these other metals. As you say, they're all there. They're plentiful. We just need to make them, cost effective to mine them. And even, rare earth. I mean, I'm actually starting to photograph all of these new mines that are going to be the way in which we get out of this problem as mining as a positive human activity, and the necessary one that we need to do to work our way out of the problem. So, but by and large, I've never had a suit come after me. I've never had real problems that way. But I've been very careful to be fair, because there is a bit of a contract when I say I'm not going to go out there and use you as an example or indict you as a bad doer or destroyer of landscape. I'll never apply that to what you're doing.
Another question? Oh, just 1 second. The mic will come to you next. Yeah.
Hi. Yes, I was noting that Ed Burtynsky mentioned that we're embarked on an experiment of moving the population from 8 billion to 10 billion. The issue of population seems to have disappeared from the discourse largely about the environmental effects. Why do you think that, back in the 60s there was talk of the population explosion, the population bomb, but now we never hear anything about the impact of the one choice that individual humans have is whether to reproduce and the effect in the environment that has.
Monique, do you want to try to answer?
Well, I think that probably part of the reason is that it's a very difficult problem to address in an ethical way, I guess. And the other is that it has also shifted, I think, the problem, and which is, as you could say, that is actually a positive thing, is that the main contributor to the expansion of the population now is longevity and not the birth surplus. So it's basically now you are in a transition phase, hopefully, where more people live longer and have better lives for a longer period of time. And while that equilibrium is trying to catch up, then the population will grow. But the question is, of course, there are areas in the world where there's still an enormous growth rate from the birth end of it, and I think that it's the jury is out on that. But I think for now it's actually a good story because the longevity is the main contributor at the moment.
There's a question right at the front here.
I would add to that most of the growth, I mean, in what I've read and seen and been to China and India, most of that is plateaued now. And it's usually as the economy gets better, as the middle class grows in China, it's also, it's plateaued, and the one-child policy helped plateau it as well. Most of the growth is sub-Saharan Africa, northern part of it, and most of it's coming now out of Africa. And most everywhere else, it's now been almost it's plateaued. So the next 2 billion, I think the population, the complete population of sub-Saharan Africa is a little over 1 billion. They're expecting it'll plateau between 3 and 4 billion. So that's where a lot of the growth is happening, and I think a lot of it also is the fact that it's in the rural areas, and the typical thing with child mortality, and if they have 6 or 7 children, 2 will die, 3 will go to the city, and maybe 1 or 2 will stay back and work the farm. So a lot of that growth is coming out of those kind of rural areas, and the kind of typical way in which a family can continue working the land, and the kind of attrition but now child mortality is improving, so less children are dying, so it's also adding to the population growth of new souls on the planet.
I think also, of course, very important is that the absolute number one remedy against the growing population is education to women. And I think that that's also something that has at least has had some traction. It might have some counter traction at the moment in various places, but I think that is important. I think what also is interesting is, of course, that in large part of kind of our type of the world, we now have a negative population curve, and that causes problems in their own right in our part of the world.
Elon Musk is saying it's the big bomb that's going to go off. So he's been speaking a lot about the fact that the declining population growth could spell disaster.
So you can choose between 2 disasters, basically.
I think you had a question.
Oh, yes, thank you. It seems to me, I'm glad you raised the issue of education, Minik, because I think just listening to the two of you, yes, I also would like to go back to bed. But it seems like we've got 2 very incompatible sociological arenas. Like we have, the climate deniers, climate change conscious groups. How are we going to put them together? They're not all necessarily art lovers. So how are you going to package your images? You also raised the fact earlier, Ed, about this benumbing wave or tidal wave of imagery that you get on the internet, a kind of preoccupation with making selfies, a kind of introverted population, if you like, humans who have that technology at their disposal are not necessarily looking outward. So the viability of making changes through art, I believe in it, but I'm not sure. And I think we have a time crunch here. Like, how do you see this being effective and bringing about positive change?
And bringing those 2 groups together.
Well, from my point of view, and it's interesting, so Jennifer Bechwell and Nick Depensier, were my collaborators on 3 films, Manufactured Landscapes, Watermark, and Anthropocene, Human Epoch, and those are the 3 films we worked on. But we were always having a conversation in that, like, how do you increase the tent? So it's interesting that to speak to the choir, and if you look at the kind of documentary films, let's say a Michael Moore, it's very pointed. It's looking for the bad guy. It's pointing them out. It's the heroic guy. I'm going to go find out what's really going on and point to the problem, and or point to the CEO who's messing things up, and that's one way you kind of a blunt instrument, a bat, and we were never interested in going at it that way. And what we're always trying to do is to enlarge the tent. In other words, that show don't tell. Like that you don't call out the bad guys, you don't call out the problem, you show the problem, or you show it in a way, and between the music and because music is really important. It keys you into how to feel about what you're seeing, and you may not immediately know why I'm having that emotional moment at this time while I'm seeing this, but you are, and that's actually been constructed. And when the music and what you're seeing are properly kind of merged together, so that you kind of emotionally go on in that space, then we feel that there's a way to reach somebody who may have been a skeptic. Now, there's always going to be the hardcore denier, and if we look and of course we have it here too, but in America it's been more kind of clearly polarized with the Trump voter and whatever, where there's like 40 to 50 million people who are all buying into conspiracy theories, still think that Trump's a good guy, and he's just being unfairly treated. Everybody's on a witch hunt for him. So when you have that kind of narrative that's actually able to keep a lot of, how do you get through and say this is actually happening when these kinds of conspiracy theories can, and part of what's allowing those to happen are those kind of echo chambers on social media and all of that. So we have a really serious problem where truth and what is the facts are now optional, that they're, alternative facts, as Kelly Conway said. So when we're not all seeing the world from some kind of previous way, we all watched Walter Cronkite or wherever, and we got our news sources that were, properly vetted and went through some hierarchy of editorial control and trying to show both sides of an argument, where all of a sudden a lot of that has moved into citizen journalism and all kinds of crazy, stories that are coming out. So we live in this moment now where it's hard for us to all share a kind of a unified narrative. And the one big one is the planet. I mean, the two extremely dangerous existential threats are all-out nuclear war, which we're now kind of as close to as the Bay of Pigs was in terms of actually thinking that something can happen, and climate change. So we have these two existential things, and it's a question of so getting back to what we're trying to do is to increase. So if you were on the edge and you all of a sudden went through and you felt something about that world and what we're doing and the kind of activity that may be harmful in the long run to the next generation if you have children, that you may actually shift them under the tent. And there's going to be some you'll never be able to shift. But it's that the skeptic but not the absolute denier, there's a chance to bring them under the tent, but I don't think there's any chance to bring an absolute denier under the tent.
Do we have time for one more question? One more, says Guillaume. And do you want to take it from the audience here, or do you have a live stream? Yeah, here? Okay, perfect. This gentleman in the front. The mic is coming. It's coming. There you go. It's with you.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to hear your reactions to the work of the other. And I would like to hear a bit of a conversation between you as to what you would like to do together.
Well, that's easy. But I think that as said before, I think that Ed's work is exactly this thing about bringing the art into and the because it moves people, and I think that exactly. You said that not every, or maybe the bad person wouldn't, subscribe to art, but I think everybody subscribes to art, and I think that if you look at all religions, they wrap their messages in music and sense and color and all this stuff, and so that's what I take from your art is that it is a. It is a way of creating a willingness to listen. But I think also in response maybe to, if that doesn't work, at least money does. And that's our hope is that actually finance has discovered that sustainable energy is much better investment than, I think that is a real change, even if art is also important. But I'm sorry, it seems like if that fails, we still have finance, and I think that's a good thing. And also, if we learn to put a price on things that have a value that comes for free now, like the atmosphere, for instance.
Well, I mean, you've worked with Olafur Eliasson, one of my hero artists, out there in the world. So that whole piece was done, and also you did another piece, which was site-specific with using the powder from the Arctic and putting it in a fountain, which was again very site-specific and very. Was it with a statue? Was
in the Versailles Park.
Versailles, yeah. I mean, I think science and art are fabulous partners, because I think. I think science can drill down and become very, very specific, but we all share the same thing, in which you present yourself with a problem and a hypothesis, and then you go out to prove whether it's possible or not, and find a way to bring it forward. And the big difference I find between science and art is like in science, when you do find the solution, it's empirical, and then all of a sudden, fellow scientists can test out, what you've done, your experiments, or what you're saying you've discovered, and prove that you've either discovered it or not. So now it goes into first principles that yes, indeed, this is a new discovery. You've done that with the beginning of life on the planet. So that, whereas art, it's more like when Henry Ford said, I know that half of my advertising works to sell Model Ts, but just don't know which half. So it's having an effect, and we get our stories from culture, whether it's from movies, from music, from pictures, from paintings. So from writing, those are the mediums through which the humanities is through which we share our stories. So in a way, there is this kind of fantastic opportunity for artists and scientists to work together, and that the storytelling becomes as important as to the new discoveries, and how do we tell that story, and how do we make it in a way comprehensible and digestible by a larger populace. And I think leaving it to scientists on their own, they're oftentimes it's just they're caught in their silo, and it takes so much to unpack a new discovery that they have to become fully concentrated. So the higher level is sometimes higher for them to go in there, and they don't. And I think I found most scientists don't like to speak in general terms. They like to speak very specifically about things.
I think really where I find the beauty in the science is not so much in the answers, but in the questions. That is, a science is capable of formulating questions that nobody have ever asked before, and we can all ponder about. And I think that brings some of the same quality to life as. And I would like to give a quote from a Danish Renaissance scientist who summed up his life work. He said that beautiful is what we see, more beautiful is what we understand, but most beautiful of all is what we cannot comprehend. So I think that that is where science also does some of, get onto your turf, basically.
What a great last quote. And what a great last question. Thank you for that. And thank you to everyone who came. Thank you. And most of all, thank you to both of you, Monique Rosing and Ed Burtynsky. It was a delightful conversation, so thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you.